In this bonus mini lecture, I want to think about how Richard Powers makes us think about characters in trees as inextricably intertwined. I'm entitling this mini lecture The Overstory Characters as Trees, Trees as Characters. If you read the novel carefully, you would have noticed that every character introduced becomes linked to a different tree. So, for example, Nicholas Holt becomes associated with the American chestnut, Mimi Ma with the mulberry tree, and Adam Apich with the maple tree. In this mini lecture, I'm going to focus specifically on Roy Brinkman and Dorothy Kazali, two characters who, in the grand scheme of the novel, may not seem to fit in the overall pattern, but two characters who I want to insist are really important to thinking about the novel's complexity. The opening chapter in which we meet these two characters reads, quote, "They're not hard to find. Two people for whom trees mean almost nothing. Two people who, even in the spring of their lives, can't tell an oak from a linden." I want to suggest that these two characters function allegorically as normative US subjects, people for whom trees mean almost nothing, right? These two characters, they're not hard to find, they're everywhere. These are normative US subjects, they're um, illiterate when it comes to trees. Or we could say that these are subjects for whom trees are illegible. So if we read this novel carefully, it may not seem too difficult to determine which tree becomes linked to Roy and Dorothy. In the opening page, they become linked to oak. Quote, "Trees actually journey across the stage. Oak, hearts of oak, armies and natives of oak, post and lintel of the house of history," end quote. Of course, when we are first introduced to them, they're going on their first date, which Dorothy suggests is that they audition for a community theater production of Macbeth, and the description of these trees marching across the stage is a final as a an incident that occurs late in Shakespeare's play. But returning to the opening paragraph of this chapter, these are two people that can't tell the difference between oak and linden. And although oak is prominent throughout most of this chapter, it's interesting that linden makes an important appearance later and becomes linked specifically with Dorothy. In fact, linden is not even introduced until the chapter's final page. On page 72, we read, quote, "As she reads," referring to Dorothy, "her eyes cloud and she drives up onto the curb and wraps her car around a parkway linden wide enough to destroy her front grille." Dorothy is almost killed in this crashing into a linden while she's reading. The next paragraph reads, "Now the linden, it turns out, is a radical tree, as different from an oak as a woman is from a man. It's the bee tree, the tree of peace, whose toxins and teas can cure every kind of tension and anxiety." Um, the linden tree is called a radical tree, and we're going to see how its radicality plays out in the course of this novel. Interestingly, Powers posits the linden is as different from the oak as a woman is from a man. And if we remember the beginning of this chapter, these are two people that couldn't differentiate between an oak and a linden. In what may seem to be a type of gender essentialism, maybe as if women and men are diametrically opposed, um, becomes an important commentary on gender relations as these two people who become coupled and uncoupled and coupled and uncoupled continually negotiate their relationship and their gendered roles. It continues this chapter. "The Lindens will come for her, starting with the ambush, but the full adoption will take years." Powers always surprises us with his poetic language. Um, as this page progresses, it's the lindens who have agencies. The lindens will come for her, starting with the ambush, but the full adoption will take years. There's a hint of what's to come, this aesthetics of prolepsis, right? This foreshadowing, if you will. Um, the lindens are going to come for her. So we're going to think, how is this a radical tree? And will Dorothy radicalize with this tree, or will the trees sort of overpower her project, her life project? I want to think about how Powers links each character with the tree, and how this isn't just a merely symbolic intertwining, but it's a radical rethinking of characters in trees because both characters in trees become invested with or imbued with agency, which we see exemplified in the sentence, the lindens will come for her. So again, every character that becomes linked with a tree, that tree is not just a passive symbol. Powers is going to radically transform the way we think about trees. Trees are going to be seen as social, as communicating, and moreover, having agency. Again, it's very common sense. It's sort of the bedrock of the humanities to think of human characters as having agencies. But to think about the wider ecological world of different species and beings, specifically here trees, as having agency, is a radically new ecological philosophy that's being played out over the course of this novel. And as we'll see, to think about trees as having agency, their agency is much more social, and dare I even say, socialist. But we'll tease out that thesis as the weeks continue. As I said in the mini lecture I also put up this week, every chapter is being told from a different genre. And we can ask, well, what's the genre of this chapter? And I want to look at two quotes that could help us think about this. First, on page 64, but there is, of course, no freedom. There are only ancient prophecies that scry the seeds of time and say which will grow and which will not. And the second quote on page 65, here's the thing, they both get cast. Of course they get cast. They were cast already before they tried out. That's how myths work. Macduff and Lady Macbeth, end quote. I want to suggest the language, as we could see in these two quotes, is gesturing that we're in the genre of myth, right? This idea that there is no freedom, that characters' lives are already dictated, this mythical challenge to human freedom. This idea of human freedom, maybe we should say, is a very recent invention of humanism, even though, I guess I said in the previous, just a minute ago, that it's foundational to the humanities. If you go back to the Greek myths, human freedom is always being challenged and squashed and maybe even seemed to be illusional because of the power of the fates of the Greek gods. So in this chapter, we're in the genre of myth, where these characters think they're making choices, but choices have already been made for them. What we can ask is, are we seriously in the genre of myth, or is this a satirical language of myth? And I think you can't answer that question until you finish the novel, but at least we begin to think about this issue. I think the important thing to take away is, if you want to write upon this issue, is to think about how every character becomes linked with the tree. And again, this is not just a form of symbolism, but a real intertwining of characters and trees, and how both are invested with agency. And if anyone wants to close read other passages, whether in this chapter or others, to think about how trees have a form of agency that shapes the lives of human actors. And this is a really radical gesture that characters' lives are being determined by non-human actors. And those actors, of course, are the trees.